Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 419, Jewish Portal Makers. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And last week, we spoke with Nate DeGroot, who's spearheading a new era at the Shalom Center as it marks its 40th anniversary. And this week, we are still focused on the topic of Jewish organizing and leadership, but now looking at a much newer project called Tish PDX, which was founded in 2018 with the mission of bolstering the leadership of young and marginalized Jews in Portland, Oregon. Our guest today, Eleyna Fugman, is one of the co-founders of Tish PDX, and she also serves as its executive director. Before we dive into that conversation, a final reminder about our Anyeshiva classes. If you are hearing this, those classes have started. But even though the classes have started, you can still sign up for them. That makes no sense. I've already missed the first class. Why would it make sense for me to sign up for a class where I've already missed the first one? Well, that's because of the miracle of digital learning. All of the classes are recorded, so you can just watch the recording of the first class and catch up. So head over to judaismunbound.com/classes and check it out. If anything strikes your fancy, you can just sign up for it. Watch the first class before the second class happens, and you'll be just fully caught up. So those classes include Reimagining Biblical Animals Beyond the Talking Donkey, taught by Laura Duhan Kaplan, Fire and Rain, Magical and Mythic Jewish Ecologies for Climate Crises, taught by Yosef Rosen, Fractals in Jewish Time, a creative exploration of Jewish time and rituals, taught by Kashira Halev Fife, Jubilees, a gateway into Jewish Apocrypha, taught by an up-and-comer called Lex Rofberg, and Judaism Inbound, an introduction to Judaism for everyone, taught by our executive director, Miriam Turlinchamp, and some other guy. That's me. This is truly your last, final, and ultimate chance to register for these classes, so don't miss that chance. Go to judaismunbound.com/classes to sign up. There is financial aid available, and there's also an opportunity to make an additional donation to help other folks with financial aid. So please do that. We are so looking forward to having you in these classes. And now just a few more words of introduction about Tish PDX and our guest today, Eleyna Fugman. Tish PDX is an incubator of new ideas and Jewish spiritual creativity on Portland, Oregon's East Side. They talk about their vision this way. Much of the Jewish emerging creativity taking place today in Portland and nationally is happening outside the framework of the organized Jewish community. East Side Portland Jews, many of whom are young or queer or in interfaith partnerships and who feel marginalized by traditional Jewish organizations, are innovating a new era of Jewish life. Sound familiar? Remember, Nate DeGroot last week had a little bit of a gloss on that. We talked about it being fourth era Judaism, but we're basically talking about the same thing. And Tish PDX goes on to say, and in doing so, they offer a tikkun, a healing, for where organized Judaism has become irrelevant. Our guest today, Eleyna Fugman, one of the founders and executive director of Tish PDX, is committed to work that revolves around building and nurturing Jewish communities that are led and centered by Jews from populations that have been historically marginalized: women, queer and trans Jews, Jews of color, and Jews not raised in Jewish communities. In 2017, Eleyna Fugman co-founded the alternative grassroots Jewish community, the Alberta Shul, and in 2018, she co-founded Tish PDX. Eleyna Fugman is also the co-founder of Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, PDX, and has served on the boards of Opal Environmental Justice, the Institute for Judaic Studies, and the Alberta Shul. Eleyna Fugman is a graduate of Brown University and has completed 2 years of Jewish Studies coursework and pre-rabbinic education at Portland State University, Aleph, Hadar, Drisha, Jewish Theological Seminary, and Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Eleyna Fugman, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's good to be here.
Well, I am excited about this because a little known part of my biography is that I lived in Portland for 2 years. And I would say that it's, I don't want to say anything bad about any other place, but I would say it is my favorite place that I've ever lived. So,
wow, high praise.
Now, that was 20 years ago, so maybe it's changed and become a hellscape.
It's only gotten better, Dan, as far as I can tell.
I feel like I've fallen short because, Dan, you used to live where Eleyna now lives. Eleyna used to live where I currently live in Providence, but I have never lived where Dan lives, which is Chicago.
Where else have you lived, Lex?
Well, I've lived in Milwaukee, so I guess that's the closest that I have come to live.
To Chicago.
It is close, yeah.
But anywho, back to you, Dan.
Anyway, so can you take us back to the founding of Tish PDX and talk about what was it that led to this organization being founded? What were you seeing on the landscape? What was the motivation?
Yeah, Tish PDX was co-founded by three people, Rabbi Ariel Stone, myself, and a woman named Kaylin Kohler-Cohen. And it came to be the way I think a lot of great collaborations come, which is through a lot of kitchen table conversations, a lot of coffee shops, a lot of thinking about what we all wanted to see in terms of Jewish life, Jewish community in Portland, on Portland's east side in particular. I came from a background of a community organizer. So I had been leading Shabbats in my home and Rosh Chodesh circles and different events for Jews, just my peers, unaffiliated, just out there in the world for about 10 years. I moved to Portland, Oregon in 2006. And Rabbi Stone comes from her background leading the only unaffiliated synagogue on Portland's east side. She had been doing that for at least 15 years. And Kaylin had been in an executive role and had a lot of experience with organizational development and organizational management. And so the three of us had a really interesting different perspectives, experience, and something all to bring to the table. What we saw was that there were a lot of younger Jews on Portland's east side who weren't connected to Jewish community and Jewish culture, who were moving here. I don't know if you've seen our latest study from Brandeis. We just did our 10-year Federation study.
Yes, indeed. We've got questions about it later.
It's fascinating. It's totally fascinating. But find that 30% uptick in growth in the Jewish community in the past 10 years. So we're seeing that on the east side, where sort of the home of alternative culture and lots of restaurants and bars and community centers. We're seeing more and more Jews sort of find their home here from Milwaukee, from Chicago, from Florida, from wherever, young Jews coming from New York. They want a better quality of life. They want that Mount Hood. They want the parks. They want Seattle. They just want this culture that we have, the music scene. But they are looking for some kind of Jewish connection, but not finding it. That was our conclusion. Because I would meet people in a coffee shop. My barista, she'd be ringing me up and she has a little Star of David. And I'm like, hi, who are you? Like, what are you doing? Do you know anybody here? She's like, no, I just moved here trying to meet people, but I don't really know how to do that. And I haven't found, I'm not going to call the JCC. I'm not going to go there, And so I can just feel it. We could all feel it. There were a lot of Jews. And I knew it because I had been working. This was my pet passion, had been creating these communal settings, places for people to plug in, kind of portals for people to create Jewish community. So I knew that from my own experience. And I also knew that there were a lot of other people like me, that I wasn't doing it alone, but that I didn't know those other people. And that seemed like a problem to me. So the idea, the impetus was, what if we could find and connect all of these younger meaning makers, portal makers, culture makers, and have them know each other and feel resourced and feel supported and ultimately not burn out. Even in a shul, it happens. People come and they lead the Shabbat dinner, team for 3 years. And then they're like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. So that was another impetus, was like, how do we resource and support these people who they burn out? We burn out because it's a lot. We're holding a lot for our people.
As I listen to you, I'm just like smiling a lot. I promise I'm not being like creepy. It's just like what you're describing is very much, in terms of the early stages of your organization, is very much what I inhabit on a day-to-day basis in Providence, Rhode Island. And I say that not because I want to be like, oh, look, it's so eerie that you and I are similar on this front in trying to create forms of Jewish life among people that don't want to really go to the JCC, who are transient, who just moved to a place, but actually because I think it's unbelievably common. I don't think it's eerie. I don't think it's weird that you and I have those parallel experiences. I do think that Providence and Portland share some interesting characteristics just in personality. They're different sizes, but like a similar set of factors that they share. I think that, and we know this because we hear from people all around the country where this is the case. In city after city after city after city in this country, there are particular areas of town that are seen as the quote unquote Jewish areas of town. Those are by and large defined based on where legacy institutions are. So where mainstream synagogues are, where JCCs are, where Jewish federations are. And then there's other areas of town, which is to say every other area of town. And you seem to have focused in on a particular area on the east side of Portland. In Providence, there is a particular area of the west side, the West End and Federal Hill, that I think is probably the most comparable area where there's a lot of young folks, not just young Jews, but like young people, a lot of queer folks, a lot of activists, and there's a lot of Jews. And it seems that whenever I say that to folks in the main organizations in town, and once again, I'm not speaking for Providence, I'm speaking about something that I think is a dynamic just about everywhere in the country, mid-sized city-wise. I bring up, I actually think of the West End and Federal Hill as like another Jewish area of town, but there are no Jewish buildings here. Yeah. Not only are there no Jewish buildings here, all of the existing institutions have formatted their work around serving a different, very small area of town. And so me and a renegade band of misfits are constantly making, Shabbat dinners pop up over here and a Purim thing pop up at this cool bar downtown and this, pop up over there. And it's sort of an ongoing, constant stream of making independent Jewish community happen from scratch. And I think I could frame it as a problem. I do think it's a bummer that mainstream organizations aren't more aware of this and aren't investing more time in this. But at the same time, I actually think it's fine because I think if they tried to, they would not actually be well suited to do it because they're a different demographic of Jewish people. And so I'd love to hear from you a little more what were the frustrations? What was happening in Portland? What wasn't? And I know you probably don't want to say bad things about local organizations, but what was really lacking here? And when you say people were burning out, I mean, I've sensed that personally. It is hard even if it's once every 6 weeks to do all the legwork to make a Shabbat dinner happen at somebody's house from nothing, as opposed to just having a rhythm of that a synagogue hosts or a JCC hosts or whatever. So talk to us a little more. What were the forms of burnout? What were the forms of things that weren't happening that needed to? What were the profiles of the people who you would run into in the coffee shop, you would run into here or there that were maybe not so different from one another when they were missing something about Jewish life, but not wanting it in mainstream institutions?
Well, I actually want to tell you a little story because I think it's illustrative of who we're dealing with and who our constituents are at Tisch. So I am from the West Coast of the United States. I'm from California, and I'm from a very small town in Northern California, 1,500 people, buried in the mountains, an hour from any large grocery store, any other town. And my experience of being Jewish growing up was that we celebrated Hanukkah sometimes. If Hanukkah happened to be on the calendar that was in our house, sometimes calendars you buy have Jewish holidays and sometimes they don't. And sometimes we would have Passover. We would have a Seder if it was on the weekend, because my grandparents lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is about a 3.5-hour drive with 2 little kids. And so if it happened to be on the weekend, we might make it to a Seder. And that was the extent of my sort of Jewish tradition. Beyond that, I did know I was Jewish, and I knew there was a social justice element to it. And I think you'll hear this a lot from younger Jews who were raised on the West Coast or Jews who were raised unaffiliated. There was that sense from my grandparents that this was part of our culture, and a little bit from my mom. My father was not Jewish, so I didn't have a picture of what that was like on his side. I had a much different picture, a different cultural picture. I didn't approach Judaism until I was almost 20. I was coming out as a lesbian at the time, and I had dropped out of Brown University and moved back to San Francisco, and I was living in the Mission District in San Francisco in the 90s. There's a lot of gay culture, a lot of queer culture, and there were 2 minyanim that I found. They weren't called that. One was called Dyke Shabbat, and one was called Queer Minyan. I guess they were called minyanim, but I found them along with a girlfriend. We were roommates, and we were over the moon, because what this meant was that we were both coming out as lesbians, but it meant that we got to be We sort of got to date, we got to go meet people, but we also got to, well, she already knew a lot about Shabbat. I had never experienced Shabbat. So for me, this was huge because I had become very interested in my Judaism. And I'd love to tell you more about that. I was raised next to an Indian reservation. The Round Valley Indian Reservation is the second largest Indian reservation in Northern California. Many tribes, Pomo, Wailaki, Nomalaki, Pit River, Concow, these and many sub-tribes. And these folks were herded literally sort of like our own mini Trail of Tears from the Central Valley of California, from the north, from the west, into this valley in the 1850s. My parents were back to the landers. They were a Jew and a Gentile roaming the world in their camper van in the late 60s, early 70s, looking for a place to raise their children. They chose this little valley. I grew up knowing that I was Jewish because people would say things like, "Oh, you're Paula's daughter." People in this little town, there was something about us that was different. They couldn't quite put their finger on it. They didn't necessarily, it wasn't scorn, it was just difference. And so I knew that from a young age, that there was some way I was different than other people. I had white skin, which was confusing to me because, half of my classmates were Native. We were half and half. There were half white folks, half Native people. But I was the only white person that I can really remember, or one of the few who had brown hair. That was sort of my distinguishing characteristic as a young girl. But I knew very early that there was oppression. There was something that was happening in the world that was not correct, that there were people that were being treated unjustly right here in my life, in my universe. I didn't have the words for it. But when I was 16, I went to this amazing summer camp. It wasn't a Jewish summer camp. It was a multi-faith, multi-generational summer camp. It was called the Encampment for Citizenship. It was actually started by, what is that society? The Ethical Culture Society was very involved with that.
So it's not Jewish, but also ethical culture's roots are from Felix Adler, who was initially going to be a rabbi. That opens up a whole barrel of interesting
things. Thanks for pointing that out. It was Jewish, and it wasn't billed as Jewish, but it sounded like there were Jewish people involved in the founding of this camp. But what it did is it opened my eyes to systemic oppression. And this is pretty early. A lot of us, I think, have come to understand systemic racism and classism and gender oppression. But my counselors were a Haitian folklorist and an Iranian political prisoner. They were grad students at Cal Berkeley, and they were there explaining the world to me through their lenses. And so I was getting this really powerful sense of especially how institutionalized racism worked. So that gave me this light. I grew up with Native people, understanding there was something wrong, and now I had words for it. I decided, based on that experience, that I wanted to be part of ending racism. I wanted to be part of this world, this culture where we ended this kind of oppression. People who were mentoring me, elders in that community, some of them were Jewish, some were not, said to me, "You can't really help other people until you know who you are. You can't do this work if you don't know your own roots and your own culture." And that was very powerful for me because I knew there was something about my Judaism that was connected to this, to social justice and to racial justice. But to have them just put it on the table, "You need to know this," really helped me. That's why I was excited to go to Dyke Shabbat, because my mentors had told me, "You need to know who you are and what your culture is and where you're from." So this was perfect for me when I landed in the Mission District in 1992 or 1993, to know that I would be able to meet other people who were like-minded, who were queer, who were Jewish, and who might want to show me.
And so from there, how did that tie to the launching of Tish PDX?
So for me, this is what Tish PDX was founded on. I had co-founders too, but this is my angle. This is where I come into it. Where I come into it was that Dyke Shabbat was my portal, was my way into Judaism. I had gone to the Hillel at Brown University, nothing. I had felt nothing. I had tried to go to a synagogue when I got to the San Francisco Bay Area. I felt nothing. I did not feel connected. I did not feel like I belonged there. I walk into this living room. There's 7 or 8 people sitting around. There's a pot, there's people getting out food. People start singing songs. People start saying the prayers and stopping and telling me what they're doing. Oh, you've never had Shabbat before. Let's stop and explain this to you. This is the prayer. This is why we're saying it. This is how we queered this prayer. This is how we're rewriting it. This is what, this is a standard prayer, but this is how we rewrote it. Actually explaining to me this whole process, not just of what we're doing, but it's sort of a meta process that I'm getting. I don't have to know the prayers, but I feel like I want to learn them now because I'm with these people who are exciting to me, who are interesting, who are engaging me. What Tish sets out to do in my mind is to acknowledge that those portals are here. They've always been here. They will continue to be here. And we want to hold and support and resource and help build those portals because there are so many people like myself who are Jewish and more people who are mixed heritage Jewish, who have some Jewish lineage and some who are craving this, who want their culture, their connection, their community, partly from a justice angle, like I was talking about with myself, partly because people know you can't change the world if you don't know who you are and you don't know where you come from. You can maybe, but it's not as effective to do it from a place not located in yourself.
So can you help us understand the model of Tish PDX as it relates to your experience? So is it basically that Tish PDX allows there to be a way for lots of different kinds of people to connect in lots of different kinds of ways? And how does it do that? Or is it more saying, no, there's a particular set of kinds of people that are basically not connected to the traditional institutions, and we have a different way to connect them?
Tish sets out to support the portal makers. We had to define our constituency in a very small way. That's what we felt like from the beginning. There was no way we were going to be able to program for that woman in the coffee shop who's wearing her chai or her Star of David and doesn't know how to connect. She's actually not our audience yet. Our audience is the person who's going to make a Shabbat or make a Rosh Chodesh circle or do a queer mikvah or do something that she's going to hear about somewhere. And she's going to say, I want to go to that thing or a Hanukkah party or whatever it is. Those are the people we're working with. We're resourcing the portal makers. So from my perspective, that Dyke Shabbat was my portal in. And 15 years later, when I moved to Portland, I realized I was going to have to be a portal maker because there wasn't a place. It took me a year and a half to meet a Jewish person when I got to Portland. Now, it's hard to say this, but now I've had people tell me I moved to Portland and the next day I found Tish PDX and I'm already going to this Shabbat and I already did this and I already did that. So just crushing that time that it takes to find your community if you're not affiliated, slicing it down, making it smaller, making it this more accessible has been a big deal.
So how do you do that? You basically identify, I guess I'm asking a few different questions. How do you identify the portal makers? How do you know what that person looks like before they're making any portals? And then what do you do with them to turn them in from a potential portal maker to a portal maker? And then again, I'm assuming that what the strategy would then be is that you just have to have a extreme diversity of kinds of portal makers because there's an extreme diversity of kinds of Jews out there. And so is it that Tish PDX's vision of the future of Jewish Portland is just where there's an immense number of possible kind of small portals through which to enter into a connection with Judaism or something else?
I just thought of this word portal land because you said that. So
Portland, Portland, Shkoyach. I love it.
Okay, this is what I want to say about this because people often ask me this question: how do you find those people? And to me, this is the puzzle that I still want to figure out with you all, for instance, with a lot of people who are doing the same work. How do we find these people? The way I find these people is through relationship building, because this is my commitment. This is my work. This is my passion. About 7 years ago, I applied and was accepted to rabbinical schools, to Hebrew College and to RRC. And I had to make this decision to leave all of this community development I had been doing for 10, 12 years and to continue my studies or to stay rooted in this place that I had committed to and see what I could figure out, how I could figure out to lead, maybe without that deep text study and the deep knowledge. And I decided to stay, obviously, here. But it was because I have this commitment to community and to network weaving. And I love that this is becoming more of a conversation in the Jewish communal world. I've actually seen this term network weaver as like a job position recently. These people need to be lifted up, need to be held, need to be trained. We need more network weavers. We need to figure out how to teach this skill. Some of us just, it's sort of natural to us for whatever reason to always be reaching out, to always be building, connecting people. How do we teach people to do that? And it needs to be acknowledged. The other thing I love about it being a paid role is I feel like it's unpaid labor. It has this whole, so many of us do it. And a lot of people who've been conditioned female, we are just conditioned to do this, to hold people, to listen to people, to help people meet each other. And so the fact that it's being recognized more as a skill and an art and something that we should pay for. The way we find people is through being rooted in local places. So even as I start to envision Tisch growing and hiring people, I'm thinking, how am I going to hire somebody who doesn't live here to come in and do this network engagement and this building? Is that even possible? I think when I think about Tisch replicating, when I think about it being in Providence or in Detroit or wherever it is, I think about this. How would I find those? I would need to find someone who's really rooted in that community, who's committed to it, who's been there 10, 15 years, who has a picture of the people, even the political dynamics of a community. There's so much you have to hold in order to create spaces and to find those people. And then you find those people naturally, because people like, oh, you just moved here, you run a Shabbat thing, you should talk to Eleyna Fugman. It becomes natural when you've been here long enough that you become that person. So I don't have to find anyone, they find me.
I'm thrilled that you achieved this without being a rabbi. I love that you brought up the choice you made actively to not go to rabbinical school. I think that so often the frameworks in people's heads are, if you want to go do work that is like a mobilization of your caring about Judaism muscles, the way to best do that is to go to rabbinical school. I don't agree with that. I did go to rabbinical school, and it was related to the fact that I care about Judaism. It was also related to a lot of other things. And I spent a lot of time wrestling with whether that was even the best decision to achieve the goals I had for my own activist work and Jewish work in the world. So I'm grateful that you made that choice and that you stayed grounded in the way that you did in Portland. I think you're absolutely right that like people need to be rooted in their place to do this. And what's hard is that in a lot of the places like a Providence, like a Portland, like others, there's a lot of folks who are recent newcomers, who are maybe they're transient, they're living there just a few years. And those people, I think in general in Jewish life, we have failed mostly to be supportive of folks who are transient, who live in places for a short period of time. Related to that, what I wanted to ask about is just getting into the portrait of Portland. And again, I'm going to keep emphasizing this throughout the episode. I think folks have a tendency to see cities like Portland as like deeply interesting and off the beaten path. And I'm not here to say that Portland is not unique. I do think that when you look at a place like Portland, it is more the case that there are dynamics at play here that are also true in all sorts of other cities than it is that we can sort of dismiss this as, oh, that's a Portland thing. That wouldn't apply to Pittsburgh or Detroit or Denver or Miami or like, I don't know, pick your city. I mostly named bigger cities, but like Providence, smaller. So I do want to get to that community study because I was interested in it from a number of levels as a reader. I read all the different local population studies because I see it as our job to do so and because I find them fascinating. I find them to uncover a lot of misconceptions that people just sort of presume without any evidence about who's Jewish, who isn't Jewish, what they're doing to activate their Judaism, what they're not doing to activate their Judaism. And so you talked about a few things. One, that the population, the Jewish population generally, forgetting what kinds of Jews, has grown a lot in Portland. That is interesting, right? Like people love to talk about scary things. Oh, intermarriage will lead to the diminishment of Jewish population, to the end of Judaism. Like the West Coast and cities like Portland have substantially higher rates of intermarriage than the Northeast and generally the East Coast. And we saw a massive growth in the population there. That is interesting. Other things that we saw there that didn't get too many headlines related to the kinds of things that people in Portland think about Israel. Turns out, according to that study, which was done by the same people who have done population studies in a lot of different places at a lot of different times, 52% of people, when asked about how they approach Zionism, said that they are not Zionist. They actively said that. It's not that they said they're not sure. 26% said that they are Zionist, and 22% indicated that they're not sure.
They're not sure,
So
that's a huge number. It's huge, people.
And that's not just young people, that is adults in Portland. And
Across
again,
the board,
we could say, oh, well, Portland's an outsider to most places. It's West Coast. I do think it's probably the case that some of these dynamics might be more pronounced in a place like Portland. But I think mostly it points to a reality across the board. And so I'd love to get specific here. Who is not having their stories told in Jewish life that is finding their ways to Tisch PDX for a variety of reasons? One set of people I am presuming is very prominent among your constituents is folks who are not Zionists, which we know from that study are a very big number of Portland. What are some of the other groups that you are connecting with? And to what degree would you say that studies like the one that happened recently in Portland help us see the need for work that reaches those people?
Tisch's mission statement is bolstering the leadership of young and marginalized Jews in Portland, Oregon. We use that umbrella term marginalized to try to hold a container as opposed to sort of silo out by LGBTQ Jews here, Jews of color here, Jews from interfaith families here. There's a lot of national organizations that I think are doing great work, really trying to pick that target. But I think in terms of being from a smaller city, needing to work in having less people, we needed to think of a way to bring all of these folks together who are, for whatever reason, not affiliated, not feeling connected, and actively being marginalized in prominent communal spaces. So LGBTQ was an easy reach for me. I identify as queer. My co-founders also identified as queer. Knowing that we cannot have the rich diversity of Jewish thought and community moving forward without more voices at the table at Tisch was really important. So bringing Jews of color, LGBTQ or not, felt really important. And then for me, it's been very important to reach to people like myself who were not raised Jewishly, who were not raised in Jewish community, who like me may have not ever experienced Shabbat until they were 20 years old, and who are actively seeking Jewish community. Those are like populations that we felt really committed to from the beginning. We realized our second cohort was by chance all LGBTQ, and it was an amazing experience. It showed us something that we didn't know was possible, which is the sort of bonding and community. We didn't decide to go ahead. We thought if we had had more funding or maybe been in a different situation in that moment, we might have started to do an LGBTQ only cohort. But it also feels like what we're trying to do is racial and gender justice. It's something we're working on with every one of our cohorts. We have a stool in our Emerging Jewish Leadership Incubator, which is what we call our cohort program. There's a three-legged stool. Jewish education, Jewish learning is something we're really wanting to give our cohort members. Access to racial and gender justice, to learnings about it, how to build that into their programming, into their whatever portals they're making, that they bring a really rich sense of how oppression works in the world and how it might even function in their programs. And then relationship building. Those are kind of the tenets that we want to bring people together under. Politically, in terms of Israel and Zionism, I want to again tell a personal story, which I found that has been very helpful the last few months as I've been talking to colleagues, cohort members, friends. My experience, I think, is not unique of being raised outside of Jewish community on the West Coast. My connection to Israel was not. There was nothing. I was not told that Israel was a place that I needed to go to. My deepest Jewish connection, my grandparents, who I love dearly, who are social justice workers, anti-war, they never went to Israel. They were born in diaspora. They never felt they needed to go there. They never told me I needed to go there. I wasn't raised in an institution that told me the importance of Israel. If anything, my family was critical of Israel. My parents were hippies, my feminists. They were, my aunt and my mother went down from Chicago to the South, as teenagers to work against racism. If anything, there was a critique of Israel. And so that's what I learned. Now I might say they were anti-Zionist. I don't, if you were going to put that lens on it now, that they never said that. They just weren't Zionist. Maybe just like what that study is saying. They didn't feel a connection. They didn't feel like it was a safe haven, which I've come to understand as I've become more rooted deeply into Jewish community. I'm grateful to have this perspective. I have a new perspective from being 20 years now, talking to people who are Zionists, who have this connection to Israel. From traveling to Israel myself, I understand the dynamic. And yet I was not, my most formative memories and relationships don't circle around Zionism. So I don't feel a strong connection. And I would say there's a lot of people in that study that are similar. There are some people who were raised in Zionist institutions and Zionist culture who might be actively reacting to that also. That's probably a big part of what you're seeing in those numbers. But I venture to say there are a lot of people like myself who just never got that connection.
Well, so whatever the particular dimension of Judaism is that we're talking about, I think that there really is a issue that we've been struggling with throughout all the years of this podcast in thinking about how some of the mainstream Jewish institutions think and work. Is they're saying, well, yeah, we understand that there's all these people out there that are not Jewish in the way that we like to be Jewish, that their manifestation of Judaism or lack of, it's not to our taste, but we understand that they're out there. And so let's try to be really super nice to them. And then we're going to try to get them to understand that the kind of Judaism that they should want to be is the kind of Judaism that we are. And I think that the alternative is something that's interesting to try to articulate. It's not to say that these folks won't. Some of them will probably really like the kind of Judaism that you do, and that'll be wonderful for you. But a lot of them are not going to. And so what is their Judaism going to be like? And I'm curious about your three-legged stool. Like, fundamentally, I'm asking how you train these portal makers, because I think that at least from the mainstream Jewish folks, there will be a sense like, well, how can some random Jew off the street create a portal that's going to give these people a rich Jewish life? Because what do they know about Judaism? And I'm curious how you square that circle.
This has been ongoing for us. So, as someone who's studied, I did pre-rabbinical training, and I'm at a certain level. I would like to be somewhere way beyond where I'm at, but I am where I am, and I've needed to focus on this work as opposed to my own Jewish learning. And one example that I love is that in every cohort, we have at least one person who was raised very deeply in Jewish community, who brings, and our cohorts are small, so 5 or 6 people, but they bring, in addition to the rabbi, then we also have these lay leaders, these people who bring deep Jewish knowledge. And that is such a great place to learn and teach from, peer learning. I think you all know this because you're so big on it also. But to learn from someone who looks like you, who has similar experience as you, is so powerful. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I think we both love Svara. I find that teaching people the Jewish year is my number one priority, just so they really, in Portland, Oregon, especially, where you're never going to see a sign in a window like I do on the Upper West Side that says candle lighting is at this time and the store is closed today for this holiday. Just getting into the Jewish cycle. Something I love is, after being here for 15 years in Portland, Oregon, and having my Jewish community, now I work for a Jewish organization. I exist in Jewish time, even in Portland, Oregon, which I think is a big deal. Because some people come at this and they know barely anything. And a good example is in cohort 2, this woman had been leading a Shabbat book club for 3 years, but she didn't feel comfortable really doing the blessings all the time. She knew she wanted to do Shabbat. She knew, and it was a racial justice theme for her book club. And she had this really committed group of people who came every month, the first Friday of every month, 10 people. They were always there. And she decided to come through Tish because she wanted to get more confident in her Jewish leadership. She knew she was doing this Jewish thing. She cared about tzedakah. She knew that word. She would have people she made it into a giving circle, but she really deepened it. She works with the Social Justice Fund. She knows about giving money from almost an outside of Jewish perspective. And she's like, I need to do this from my perspective as a Jew. And so it's a good example of who we reach for in Tish, people who are already leading, who have already found a way to lead and to say, I'm here and I want to create Jewish space, but I want to deepen my practice. I need support. I need help.
So I'm kind of curious. You were talking about if you were ever going to expand this to other cities. And by the way, like Tish PVD, which is Providence's airport code, it's got a nice ring to it, just throwing it out there. But like, it's important for people to be rooted locally. Yeah. And you cited specifically to have an understanding of local politics. I really want to think about the local politics side. And I mean that both in the like big capital P politics sense. And in the Jewish politics sense. I'm flashing back to some really, really early episodes of our podcast with a couple people, one with Beth Finger, another episode with Debbie Bravo. And each of them, they weren't exactly the same model as each other, and they're not exactly the same model as you, but they were starting up efforts to engage groups of Jews, pretty specifically outside of legacy institutions, not because they had some vendetta against the JCC or the synagogues, but just because they recognize that the practical reality is that, as you said, there's people who are working at a coffee shop or at any other walk of life who are just, they're not going to go to those mainstream spaces. So if we care about Jewish life beyond just those who will set foot in those places, we have to create alternative things. And we talked with them a lot about whether and to what extent the work they did was posed as like poaching. Like, you're coming in, people would be members of the synagogues, but now they're not members of the synagogues because they do your thing. And oh my gosh, that's so terrible for Judaism. I kind of want to sit with that, not because I think it's legitimate. I couldn't possibly, look, I'm not a synagogue member as we speak. I'm, part of a fun club of rabbis who are not synagogue members. I have put my entire life and time into building forms of Jewish existence and meaning that are not just in those spaces, because I think in the grand scheme, we are lacking in that department. But so I'd love to hear from you, like, what's your response? How do you go about that question of like, oh, well, you're poaching folks? Because like, on the one hand, you could say, no, we're not poaching. We're just reaching people who aren't going to go to those classic institutions. But like, I kind of want to say, and I mean this positively, I think some of the people that Tish PDX's portal makers engage, like, if those portal makers didn't exist, would some of Tish PDX's people like try out the synagogue or the whatever and not learn about Tish PDX the day after they move, as you said that they do? I actually think some would. Now, do I think they'd be super satisfied? I think a lot of them wouldn't be. We have evidence of that in every community in the country, of people who don't feel particularly satisfied by their institutions. But I think we're often quick to leap to like, no, we're not a threat. We're not poaching. When we might want to say like, if Tish PDX is creating great forms of Jewish life that some people think are more engaging and more meaningful and more justice-driven than local synagogues or JCCs or whatever, maybe that's not a sign that they're doing something bad in poaching. Maybe that's a sign that they're doing something really good.
Particularly in Portland, we've been lucky because we have the east side of Portland is huge population, huge number of Jews for our community. And there's one synagogue and there's 2 Chabad houses. It's hard for anybody to say that we're poaching anyone from anywhere because there's just not something there. Now, if there were 3 or 4 small shuls and they, had lefty politics, we're trying to bring people together, and we kept saying, no, we're really focused on, I don't think that Tish would have happened like that if that was the case. I think that we would have been in conversation with all these smaller shuls who are struggling to, and say, it looks like we're all trying to do something. How do we do this together? Maybe Tish can support the maybe we can send people back and forth to each other. That's, for me, in my mind, that's how you operate. You operate based on relationships, connection, who's in the room, who's not in the room. And I feel like so far we've had a pretty good relationship with the institutions, partly because I worked at the conservative synagogue before I started Tish. So I know the people there. And, I've been in connection with the rabbis at the big Reform synagogue, and they know what we're doing. And I have conversations. We've even talked about possibly trying to collaborate. We were in an upstart cohort together, the ED at the big Reform shul and myself. So we had a chance to talk and think about, are there ways we can collaborate? One of the things I would hope is that there'll be some smaller shuls that will grow one day out of Tish. We have one small shul that Tish is in network. It's called the Alberta Shul. It doesn't do Shabbat programming yet. It just does holiday programming. But I want that to keep happening. If there are religious communities that need or should be grown on Portland's east side, I'd like to see that happen. If it happens through Tish, great. If it happens through partnerships with other organizations, great. I don't think that we've gotten into that dynamic in Portland of you're poaching people. I do see that between synagogues sometimes, but I've really tried to keep Tish out of that fray.
Are there things that you have been finding through the work of the portal makers that are especially resonating with people? Like, you're talking here about maybe some synagogues will grow out of these portals one day. And yes, maybe they will. I'm curious whether other things might grow from them as well.
Some of the things that excite me the most, this year, for instance, one of our cohort members did a trans tefillah workshop. So they had people come together and learn to lay tefillin.
And tefillah being the word for prayer in Hebrew.
Yeah, thank you. But they taught people to lay tefillin. They sourced, I helped them with this. They sourced old tefillin from local synagogues. This was a cool example of a relationship. I sent them to the local synagogues. I said, tell them what you're doing and what you're trying to collect. So they collected tefillin. They had a friend of theirs who was very knowledgeable, come and teach people to lay tefillin. They did an outdoor, we're still very COVID cautious, a lot of our communities. So they did an outdoor Sunday morning minyan where people laid. And that's one thing that excites me, is that people are figuring out prayer spaces. But in terms of other things that people are figuring out, in our first cohort, we had a very experienced yoga teacher who was raised in Jewish community and had been trying for years to figure out how could I bring these two things together? I have this deep knowledge of yoga, deep knowledge of Judaism, but I don't know how to do it. And she used her time in Tish very specifically. We actually pay people as part to be in our cohorts, which is a different model. People are paid $1,800 to participate in that 10-month program. And she developed a Jewish yoga curriculum. And she started something called the Portland Jewish Yoga Collective. A woman joined that collective. And then 3 years later, that woman wanted to be in Tish because she had now seen herself as a Jewish yoga teacher. And she wanted to keep honing her skills and working and thinking about this practice with Tish. In terms of burnout, I love the idea that you can kind of start a project and then pass it on to someone else. Another ongoing project is, and these are things that are happening all over the country. I want to acknowledge we're not unique. So this idea of queer Jews singing together, let my people sing, the queer Nigun circles. Well, we have one here too. And it was someone's Tish project. 2 people actually decided to collaborate in year 3. They said, we really want to build something like this. They called it the Queer Tet. It's been going for years now. It happens regularly, semi-regularly, every month, every other month. And, this year, it was so cool. They collaborated with a local synagogue and asked to use their cemetery on Tisha B'Av and decided to do a singing circle in a cemetery in this really distant part of Southeast Portland where nobody ever goes. So we all got to visit this ancient Jewish cemetery that we never go to and sing together.
By the way, I love the idea of an ancient Jewish cemetery in Portland because, obviously Portland's not that old of a place.
Ancient, yeah. But maybe that's the wrong word, but
well, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting word. I did want to just pick up quickly on one other thing, which is that you said it's not unique what is happening in Portland in terms of what some of the projects are. But what does strike me as unique is that there's a training program that's intentionally trying to make these things happen. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the content of that training program. Like, what is it that you have discovered is the most important things for, let's say, a city? I mean, let's say Tish doesn't want to come to Providence. I can't imagine that. But let's say that Lex wanted to take your best practices and create a Tish PVD of his own. What is important for people to understand that really works?
Again, this comes out of my experience, and my co-director, Derek Travers, really have been committed to this idea of racial and gender justice being part of what we teach. Healthy communities that thrive and that can grow and that can vision and can be liberatory need to be grounded in political education, I think is a word I like to use, and people really understanding oppression and how systems work and how, as Jews, how we're subject to anti-Semitism and how we might be acting out racism and how we might be acting out classism or subject to those things. And, to have people have technical skills there is very important. I think that it's a missing piece sometimes. I think Avodah, I think there are Jewish organizations that try to give that lens of politicalness and oppression and how these things work together and having hard conversations. I mean, I think that's another thing that makes this community stronger is we have hard conversations. We talk about how does racism play out in this group right here? Or how does Ashkenormativity play out here? Or how are class dynamics working in this group? When you have those harder conversations, you get stronger. And sometimes you lose people too. It's not automatic, but you can get stronger. And that's what I'm so excited about. I see this weaving. I always try to use this metaphor. When I was in kindergarten, I learned to make a placemat where I wove pieces of paper together. And that's sort of what I'm trying, what I want to see is that the strength you get from binding, from weaving people together into these networks, into these communities where we're resilient too. When hard things happen, like what's been happening the past few months, there's some resilience that people have in the relationships that they can then act on and do things that are morally just, that are sound, and that keep us in community.
Yeah. So whenever we record episodes like this, I am always deep diving geekily into websites, and I found something really fun on your website. It's really fun, but I also think it should be normal. It should be that we understand this as something that would be on just about everybody's Jewish community website. What I found was you go to About, and there's lots of different things, and one of the options is a history of East Side Portland's Jewish community for the last, 100 and some years. That's really cool.
Yeah.
And I want to name that it's like, it shouldn't strike us as all that cool. Like, it's so bizarre to me that we grow up in Jewish communities. Like when I go to Europe, I haven't gone to other areas of the world's Jewish community, but if I went to North Africa, if I went to India, and you visited a cool synagogue building, they would tell you about the history of that building. They would tell you all sorts of things about the founders, what's happened over the centuries. I don't think that your typical, even synagogue going, even regular participant in Jewish communal life in an American Jewish city, I don't think they can tell you very much about their city's Jewish history or their neighborhood's Jewish history, certainly. This is not just about Portland. This is about East Side of Portland and telling that specific story. And that's so sad. Why do we think, and I'm not saying we actually think this consciously, but I think subconsciously, we don't actually believe that every single place on the planet, or at least every single place with Jewish community of some kind, has a real story to tell. I don't think we are losing sleep at night. People are losing sleep at night over all sorts of Jewish things. I'd like them to lose sleep about some different things. And one of them is that I'd like them to lose sleep at night over the fact that people on the west side of Providence can't tell you the Jewish history of the west side of Providence. Or the fact that people in the east side of Portland, although more of them can because you have it on your website, can't talk about the history of the east side of Portland. To what extent is part of what you're doing just modeling what it is to be, as you said before, a diasporic Jewish community where we buy into the notion that our place is a sacred, special Jewish place? Not only are we going to have people that do cool things that could, we're going to have people do queer Jewish singing that could also happen at Let My People Sing and others, but we're also going to go to that cemetery in distant southeast Portland, and we're going to have a program there because you know what? Every single place deserves that special Jewish program that celebrates that heritage. And everybody buried in that cemetery deserves to have their memory not just a thing of the past, but a thing enlivened and celebrated and cherished now. So the fact that you go to that cemetery, it doesn't surprise me because, again, you have that section of your website. For a lot of communities, they lose more sleep at night over people not knowing about Jewish history in other areas of the world than they do about Jewish history in their corner of the world. So I'd love if you could just give us some teachings about how you've incorporated that into your work.
I had two thoughts, really strong thoughts that came from this question. One is, I think that there's a disconnect that I really want to challenge people around, which is this idea that unaffiliated Jews and institutions are at odds. I see so much the yearning to connect. And I think people feel this strong feeling of I don't belong or I'm not wanted. The thing I wanted to say about the timeline is that, my teachers have taught me that you never start something without looking at what's happened already. You never try to start something without looking where did you come from? What the work you're doing, what is it based on? Who did this work before you? So I'm made that a project. Let's research. It was an amazing brainstorming session. We had some community members come in. It was in the second cohort of Tish where we created that timeline. We had some elders come in and we opened to the floor. Tell us everything you know about East Side Portland from 1850 till now. And we built this beautiful timeline. And what I want the Tishies or our group to also see is that we're not special. There was somebody making a Shabbat in their house in 1925. There were Jews trying to figure out how to connect who maybe they didn't have enough income or like status to get to the other side of town. Literally, one of the buildings that we found in this process, that's why these Russian Orthodox Jews started this little shul in the Alberta neighborhood, is because they couldn't get across town. It just wasn't possible for Shabbat. And so you're not doing something new here. And we hope that strengthens you. We hope that you see all the people doing work. There was an East Side Minyan in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. There have been people doing things. Even, Tish is only unique, I think, in that we're trying to connect and collect those people. But it's not like this lay-led, unofficial Spark portal community hasn't always been happening here or in any other city. And that's what's sort of exciting, right? Is that this is probably happening everywhere. So the potential to collect and connect these people can happen everywhere. Every little city, every big city, really, in the United States, probably around the world.
Thank you so much, Eleyna, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Lex. Thank you, Dan. It's really great to talk to you today. And I look forward to being in continued conversations with you both.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As we close, a reminder that we love hearing from you. Please send us your questions, your thoughts, your ideas, your visions. All of those are welcome in any of the following ways. First, there's our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter feeds. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can check out show notes for this episode and all sorts of other resources. You can also head to our classes page to sign up for our On Yeshiva courses. They started last week, but it's not too late. You can catch up and watch the first recording if you still want to sign up. And you can also email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. And one last thing, we are, of course, really, really grateful to anybody who's able to support us financially with either a monthly recurring donation or a one-time gift. You can do either of those at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.